Hi, my name is Amy Cook, and this is the second part of some information sharing that I'm very happy to do on a Kingian Nonviolence course that I took in 2018. In this section, I want to cover the 6 principles and 6 steps that were taught in this course. And this is extraordinarily brief, but hopefully it will give some guidance onto how to really practice Kingian nonviolence in a social action context. And the first section that I recorded was really on the spiritual basis of nonviolence. And these steps and principles expand on that. So that first step, really having the inner orientation toward nonviolence, can really help us when we're faced with intense conflict, possibly violence, when we can draw on those spiritual resources and truths that can ground us in our nonviolent practice. So the very first principle of Kingian nonviolence, and Martin Luther King Jr. laid these out in his book, Stride Toward Freedom. The very first principle is that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. One of the things that King pointed out is that nonviolence can take a great deal more courage than violence. And we tend not to think of it that way. We tend to think of walking into violence with violence as requiring courage. But it's actually a strategy that when we use violence, it's because we know no other way. The strategy of nonviolence takes tremendous courage. And all we have to do is remember back to the videos that we've all seen, the footage of nonviolent civil rights protesters sitting at lunch counters while people put cigarettes out on their heads, when protesters were in the streets and being hosed down with fire hoses, being attacked by dogs, and standing their ground against all odds. And that moral courage is really the courage that we bring to the practice of nonviolence. When we really embody that positive force, that our indignation and spiritual, emotional, and intellectual capabilities all come to bear on injustice, then we stand in a courage that can face violence, that can face enormous difficulty, enormous hardship. That courage is really what we're called to. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is that the beloved community is the framework for the future. And that, again, just harkens straight back to our spiritual basis, that what we are creating in the practice of nonviolence, we are creating the beloved community. We want to achieve a reconciled world. We want to raise the level of relationships among people to a height where justice prevails, where people can all attain their full human potential. And one of the things that we see in this practice is that if you are facing an aggressor, someone who is oppressing others, they are also not living up to their potential as human beings. And we know how painful that is. So if we can see them with the eyes of the heart, and see the beauty in the other, we know that we are reaching that place where the beloved community really can be actualized. Principle number 3 is that we address the forces of evil, not persons doing evil. And this is a really important core principle of nonviolence, that we do not attack people. If we see that of God in every person, if we see spirit in every person, if what we know we want to do is create a community with no one left out, then that person whom maybe is doing something that we're very, very upset with, that person is not the problem. The problem is the forces that created that person being able to act in that way. So we struggle against racism. We struggle um, against the forces in our world that create inequity, but we do not fight people. We fight the sources of evil, not people. This requires, and we'll see this in the next section where we talk about the steps. We must really understand what is behind the actions that people take. So we may understand that there are, internet forces. We can see it on Facebook. We can see it on Twitter that inflame people's sense of scarcity or people's sense of fear. As much as we can try to understand the forces that have created the ability of this person to act in this way, the more we can try to open our heart to how it might shift and how this person might be able to heal that place in themselves that gives rise to their actions. The principle number 4 is that we accept, and this is a hard one, we accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve a goal. So accepting suffering without retaliation. We live in a world that retaliates. We live in a world where we have been taught that if you do something wrong, then you suffer for it. Or if somebody does wrong to you, then it is right to make them suffer for it. So in the practice of nonviolence, we transcend that, or we try to, we work at transcending it, to accept that we are going to suffer in this cause of bringing about the beloved community of humanity, that we self-choose our own suffering. This does not mean that we don't honor ourselves, and it does not mean that we don't have boundaries that protect ourselves, but we do realize that the moral orientation toward being able to accept that you will suffer in the practice of nonviolence, it communicates a great deal about commitment. And again, going back to those videos and that footage that we saw in the civil rights movement and in other nonviolent movements, I think of Gandhi's Salt March, when thousands of people marched directly toward the guns, directly toward soldiers who were killing them. And, that's an extraordinary commitment, and that is voluntary. That is a voluntary walking toward suffering for the sake of a cause that you recognize as larger than yourself. Principle number 5 is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. And this again is, every single one of these, to embody them is extraordinary and that's why the first principle is courage, because everything after that takes extraordinary courage. So if we are blaming ourselves, if we denigrate ourselves publicly, if we intentionally put ourselves in harm's way, all of that we have to be very careful of, that our internal state is one of self-care. Principle number 6 is that the universe is on the side of justice, and that harkens again back to the spiritual basis of this work, that truth is universal, that it's recognizable all over the world in every single culture. Every human being is oriented toward justice. Then the fundamental values of every religion um, is toward justice. That the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Um, so those are the 6 principles of nonviolent practice. The 6 steps of Kingian nonviolence take place in the context of the 6 principles. And again, they're a lifetime of work. The first step is that we don't engage in any action until we've done information gathering. So the way that we determine facts, the way that we look at the options for change, at how we time things, at what the issues actually are that we are working with, the very first step is information gathering. And that can include education of ourselves and include education of other people. As we know right now, so many people have engaged in a powerful self-education around racism and how racism has colored every one of our lives. And sometimes those realizations have been extraordinary and painful, and they will help heal racism in our world. So information gathering is step number 1. Step number 2 is education, and that's where the information gathering is shared. Step number 3 is personal commitment. So really looking at your involvement in the campaigns that you're choosing to take part in, what that involvement is, long-term, short-term, being really clear that you know what you're committing to and that you can do that full-heartedly. Step number 4 is negotiation. This was a very important part of the civil rights movement that isn't always so public or seen so clearly. That it's the art of bringing your views to whatever opponent you are working with to transform an issue. What we want to do first is negotiate. We don't walk in with an antagonizing attitude. We really want to negotiate. That's nonviolence. Negotiation is always the preferred way of creating change. It's through dialogue. It's through understanding. We want to together arrive at a just conclusion to whatever the issue at hand is. The 5th step is direct action. So if negotiation breaks down and understanding is not able to take place, this is when justice is not being achieved in that place of dialogue. Then we design a direct action. It's really important that the direct action be able to illustrate the moral high ground of the injustice and what is desired to create the healing, and that can speak to every heart that sees it. And this final step is maybe the most important step. It's reconciliation. And so that part is really key because it brings both sides together. Nobody loses. That opponents and proponents celebrate a victory that creates a joint leadership to keep the change going. Without that, we just perpetuate the divisions that create more injustice. So that final part, reconciliation, is really key. So this was a lot of information in a really short time. The 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence and the 6 steps of Kingian nonviolence, and both of those are available as handouts. And I hope that we can all work with these to create the change that we all want to see in our community and in our world. Thank you.